let's just begin by sort of an open question. You've got an interesting background personally and professionally. Why don't you just tell people a little bit about that so they can get a sense of who you are?
Sure. Thank you for that question. As I said before, hello, everyone. So I started at NDRN 6 months ago. As she indicated, I'm the second ED there, the first woman, the first person of color. I'm Cuban. And it's been interesting to be back in DC after having spent some time in Massachusetts. But my background is varied. I've been a special education teacher and administrator. I've been a civil rights attorney. I've been an advocate. I've done violence prevention and anti-terrorism work. I've done a little bit of everything, but the string that has always held everything together was my passion for advocating for the rights of children and youth with disabilities. And so I've done that as a child welfare attorney, representing the state, and then representing parents. And some folks think, oh, at least my Judge Jacobson said to me, you've gone to the dark side. When I started representing parents in child abuse and neglect cases. But think about this. As a parent's attorney, there are times when children are removed from the parent's care and the removal was unwarranted. And so in those opportunities, I was able to advocate for reunification. And in situations where parents presented with disabilities, I was able to advocate to ensure that there was a life coach placed in the home to assist the parents in financial, management, to just walk them through the day in and day out of life to ensure that they could be reunified with their children. But in the case, and I've had a handful of those, where the abuse was so egregious that it ultimately led to multiple traumas for the child or children, I was able to either speak some sense into them or have them evaluated to ensure that the decision that they made to surrender their rights was done in an informed and appropriate manner. So it wasn't really the dark side, because I still viewed it as my ability to look out for the rights of the children. I've, represented youth in juvenile court, and I've always worked to advocate for the rights of dually involved youth, specifically youth in the juvenile justice and foster care system who also have a disability or disabilities, to ensure that the IEP follows the child, which it doesn't always follow, as we all know. And I've also been a guardian ad litem, attorney ad litem, and yes, but at the end of the day, whether I'm doing that or I'm doing civil rights, it's always about advocating for the rights of people with disabilities, because as we know, civil rights is disability rights, and disability rights is civil rights. So,
thank you for that. And I just want to make sure, so you have these multiple identities, right? I mean, I've heard you speak. You mentioned that you are Latina, that you are female. You're also the first person with a disability to lead the National Disability Rights Network. That's really important to me. Then, you're also an immigrant. You're also a single mom. You're a lawyer. You're a special education teacher. So can you talk a little bit about how this funnel of identities feeds into your role at the National Disability Rights Network and what you want to bring to this network that we haven't had before?
So for me, when we provide services to anyone that we're working with, it's very important to look at the whole person, to not just focus on one aspect of that person's life or that person's need. And so we have to take into account the intersectional identities that exist. And time again, whether we're in the disability rights arena or the civil rights arena, we always have this tunnel vision as to what does this person need in the here and now. And so I always attribute the way I approach things, like how I approached it when I was a staffing specialist with the public school system. We had a multidisciplinary team, and we would meet together. And when it was done right, we discussed everything that was needed for that one particular student. When I worked at the high risk clinic at the University of Miami Medical School, like I was the case manager for children born addicted to crack. This was many, many years ago. But it was bringing everybody to the table to determine what services needed to be provided, not only for the child to reach his or her full potential, but also for the family to be able to be there for their child and to provide them with the home that they deserve and that they're seeking. And so when we have discussions at NDRN or throughout the network, we can think about, okay, what does this particular individual with a disability require as it applies to housing? But are we taking into account whether the individual is also a person of color? Are we taking into account the socioeconomic status of that individual, the individual's family? Are we taking into account whether they live in a community that may be a food desert, and how do we address those needs as well? What about the school? Is it a Title I school? Are resources being put into the school that are necessary in order to allow this student to receive any services that are warranted as part of the IEP? So we're talking about multiple disciplines that we need to consider when we're discussing anything for anyone that we're providing services for. And what my abuela always used to say was, you know, having a roof over your head is really so very important, because to have a home to be at, right, and to go to, really puts you one step ahead of everyone else. So what about our youth that are houseless? What about our, you know, the folks that we serve that don't have a roof over their head? If they don't have housing, we can provide any and all services imaginable that are accessible to us. But if we don't have the discussion about housing, do you have stable housing? It goes by the wayside. And so I think about being a single mom. If I'm having a meeting, I'm holding a meeting somewhere and I'm asking the community to come and listen in, what time am I scheduling that meeting for? Am I providing childcare, right? Can I do a weekend meeting and maybe pair up with someone who's trusted in the community? In some communities where I worked during my time at Department of Justice, we made sure that we partnered with faith leaders because there was that trust involved. So who's at the table? Who are we inviting to the table? And who are we having conversations with to ensure that we're getting a full picture of each individual and their family, to ensure that it's culturally sensitive and competent, any services that we're delivering, that it's language accessible, and just accessible overall. Because at the end of the day, when I have multiple identities, you understand that there will be situations where you don't feel like you belong. And so the importance of the work that we do on a regular basis is to ensure that everyone that we come in contact with walks away feeling like they were seen, like they were heard, and that we allowed them to realize that they do belong, that they have a right to be there, and that we honor them.
Awesome. Thank you for that too. So I want to dig into your reference to DOJ a little bit. We did a little bonding yesterday, the aha moment around the killing of Freddie Gray, young man with a disability who was killed in an encounter with the Baltimore City Police. I was living in Baltimore at the time, and you were working for the Department of Justice then. You did some really interesting work at the Department of Justice. Can you let folks know a little bit about that job that you had?
Absolutely. One of the hardest professional jobs I've ever had, not because the work was hard, but the emotional toll that it took was a toll. It was difficult. So I had the honor and the privilege of working for the Obama administration. And my last 2 years, I shifted from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights to Department of Justice Community Relations Service. Has anyone ever heard of CRS? Okay. Excellent. So CRS was established by the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title 10, and CRSers are considered America's peacekeepers. So during times of civil unrest, CRSers are deployed into the community confidentially to work with community members, law enforcement, elected officials, to bring folks together, have facilitated dialogues, implement talking circles, and really get to the bottom of whatever difficulties may arise. We were in Ferguson for 18 months. We were deployed to Baltimore after Freddie Gray passed away. And I think the most striking thing for me was being in a conversation and hearing about the fact that there were so many other issues that were not being acknowledged in the community in Baltimore in and of itself, within the school system, within the social service system, just opportunities in general that were lacking, that ultimately fed the fuel and the anger. And I think what people failed to understand during that uprising was that law enforcement decided, we're going to shut down the public transportation system, and students use public transportation to get home. And then we're going to release all students from the school. And that is what you saw bubbling up and ultimately spilling over on national television. I'm not here to say yes or no, it was right or wrong what they did. I'm here to say that it was difficult to be on the ground and to hear from the community members how they felt unseen, unheard, and forgotten. And how that anger bubbled over because law enforcement wasn't listening to what they had to say. And time again, in Ferguson, this happened. We responded to the Charleston 9 massacre. And the difference between the Charleston 9 and what we saw in Baltimore was, it was stark. Right? The post-Charleston 9 massacre, the community came together as one. They were somehow able to let go of the anger. And they prayed together on the streets, they held hands. And it was different, but they had different tools to work through the anger that they felt and what they had just experienced from a traumatic perspective. Whereas Baltimore didn't have the same tools to work through that. And so CRS went in trying to work with the youth specifically. Hey, let's find, after school jobs, let's do some summer activities, like there was so much work that we did. I can't go into details because it's confidential in nature. But in every community that we enter, after Philando Castillo was shot by an officer, the work that we did in that community was different than, when Tamir Rice was shot and killed. That was also a really hard moment. The Pulse nightclub, we responded to that massacre, and that was a different approach. But at the end of the day, it was always bringing folks into a room and having facilitated dialogues, as many dialogues as were needed, to hear from each individual, to acknowledge their pain, to acknowledge their anger, and to give them that space to be themselves and to speak to why they were angry, why they were upset, and what they needed to heal, and what they wanted to have happen to change the community that they were residing in. Were we always successful? No, we were not. But we tried, and we gave the communities that we worked in the opportunities to be heard and to have those conversations. And sometimes all you can do is give the communities the tools that they need to then continue to do the work, to come to some sort of understanding. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but you have to try, and you have to try honestly and earnestly.
Well, hopefully everybody understands that Marlene is not someone who shrinks away from any challenge. I want to pick up a little bit on, you talked about how Baltimore struggled because it's such a fractured community compared to other communities that were able to come together, because our theme is Stronger Together, North Carolina. And I just want to make sure that everybody knows that Marlene, as the head of the National Disability Rights Network, is overseeing an organization that provides support to 57 protection and advocacy organizations. So Disability Rights North Carolina is the protection and advocacy organization in our state, but there are 56 other sister organizations that we have. So there's a P&A, protection and advocacy, in every state and territory. So
And the Native American
and
P&A.
the Native American P&A, right. And so one of the things that I know you're planning to do as the director at NDRN is to make the P&As stronger together so that we're being more unified. You mentioned like the intersectionality, that is part of the strategic plan of NDRN, is that the P&As are going to use an equity lens and intersectional approaches. Another one is that the P&As be united in advocating for true community systems so that people with disabilities can be fully included in the fabric of our society. So talk a little bit about that. I know you aren't going to just, follow along in your predecessor's footsteps. You're going to shake things up a little bit. What ideas do you have to unify the P&As and get everybody building these true community systems where everybody's included?
Well, first, I'd like to say that folks are already getting tired of me in DC because they'll have meetings and they won't have NDRN at the table. And I'll call them and I'll be like, why wasn't I invited? Not because I think highly of myself, but I'm representing our community. And why weren't we invited? And it's like, well, this isn't a disability issue. And I'm like, how so? You're talking about housing. You're talking about transportation. You're talking about public benefits. You're talking about access to healthcare, right? You're talking about voting. So it doesn't matter that you're specifically focusing on a piece of that might affect the disability community. You're talking about anything that happens in our day-to-day life that affects the disability community. So you need to have me at the table. And so my favorite remark is, well, that was a missed opportunity for intersectionality. No, wasn't it? And it is what it is. I want to be in everybody's face so that they understand. Every time there's a meeting about any discussion, whether it's at the national policy level or it's going to trickle down to the state level, I want to be at the table. And if I personally can't be at the table, someone from NDRN should be at that table, because it is so very important that the voices of the folks in our community are heard. Now, I can't speak for every person with a disability, obviously, right? I can't do that. But I sure as hell can, oh, sorry.
Secular talk. We're having a secular talk up here.
Yeah, okay. But I can represent our rights, right? Because time and time again, we're pushed to the side. So I have disabilities. They're invisible in nature. So people automatically assume, well, what do you know? Well, I know as I get older, I may not be able to walk, right? And as we all age, we are all going to have some sort of disability, period. And we should all be thinking about that. I don't care how young you are. We should all be allowed to age in place. Why do I have to leave my home? Why is it that when you do your little urban planning, you forget about the size of the door frames or making sure that the ramps are at the appropriate, degrees, that your sidewalks are accessible? Why are we not doing curb cuts? And don't look at me and say, well, we don't have the money for that this year. You better find the money, right? Because we live in your community. We put you in office. And what people fail to understand is that those of us in the disability community, we are so strong when we unite. There is so much power in our vote. There is so much power in the movement. And so I was recently speaking to someone and I was like, remember the civil rights movement? Well, the disability rights movement is just as big and just as important. So why don't we join forces? And so I just had that conversation on Friday. I'm edging my way there, but like we should all have our voices heard. We should all be at the state capitol. I'm all about sit-ins. My goal, as my kids say, you're crazy, mama, is to be arrested one day because I decided that I was going to protest and I didn't feel like moving, right? I have no qualms for that. And so my goal is to not only amplify the voices of everyone we serve, but to also amplify the voices of the individual PNAs and the work that every PNA is doing. We need to be taking a look at maybe regional, right? So I was the ED for the Massachusetts Protection and Advocacy Agency for 3.5 years. And while there, all of the New England PNAs got together and we were able to identify that individuals with TBI, traumatic brain injury, were being placed in nursing homes across state lines because they could get more money that way. And so we joined forces to try to figure out how could we push back on this from an advocacy perspective, from a policy perspective. And the goal is to ultimately push back from a litigation perspective. And so my vision is to really bring in a litigation director to NDRN that can help and co-chair with PNAs to file federal lawsuits at the regional level if necessary, to really push back on some of these policies that are negatively affecting our communities and that are crossing state lines. So that's one thing that I'd like to see. I also think that it is very important that the next generation of advocates are well trained when it comes to disability rights advocacy. And so how can we make sure that the next generation coming out of college has an interest in what we do? How can we make sure that law students understand that this is a career? And the work that we do with disability rights is, I believe, one of the most important areas of civil rights that anyone can do. And so we need to work with up and coming attorneys, policy advocates, elected officials to really raise awareness about the needs of our community, the fact that we don't want to be put in a corner. We don't want to be silenced. We all have something to say, and we should be allowed to say it. You know, one of the things that I always say is Shirley Chisholm, right? DC, she used to say, they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your own folding chair. And that's great. I got my own folding chair. I really do. But sometimes they still don't even invite me to enter the room. So I'm going to start building my own damn table. And I'm going to start inviting people to my table so that then I can lead the conversation. So
They also say if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, right?
yes.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm nobody's main menu. No, sorry.
So I guess I want to just mention real quickly, it might be of interest to people here, that one of the issues that we're working on at Disability Rights North Carolina is to give children and youth the opportunity to get behavioral health services in the community, in their homes, in their schools where they are, instead of being ignored until some crisis, escalates and they end up in a residential treatment facility that's not therapeutic, that is in fact abusive, sometimes far from their homes, sometimes out of state. So we have that same problem here too. And we and took a regional approach to that. So there are a number of our sister organizations here in the Southeast that are also working on this same issue because the regulatory environment is such that it's very profitable. So more and more of these places are proliferating. So we share that vision of the PNAs being able to collaborate more, because just like individual people, organizations have different strengths and weaknesses. So
Right. And when an issue comes to our attention, that's maybe a national issue, but as we read the proposed policy or regulation, we see the, for lack of a better term, trickle down effect that it's going to have on different communities. We do reach out to the different P&As and we say, hey, heads up, this is what's going on. Would you like to provide some comments on this that we can then take to Congress? Let's jump on a call. Let's strategize to identify, what efforts we should have in place to push back on these changes. And it's always about collaboration and it's always about community. But it's very important to always come together and not think you can do it alone. But it's also important to know that you have allies outside of the disability rights community. And you need to reach out to those allies. So a perfect example is the National Voting Rights Coalition. We have multiple partners at the table, whether it's nonprofit, for-profit, and we're all striving to ensure that our voting rights are not diminished, taken away, that everyone has the ability to vote independently and privately, not just including the voters with a disability. And we saw that during COVID, right? All of a sudden COVID came and they're shutting everything down and they're telling folks, if you want to vote, this is the only way that you can do it, not taking into account the needs of the disability community. And the fact that it was dangerous. It was dangerous to go out there to be around folks and be in line for hours at a time because they closed down half of the polling places. And so across the nation, we saw many of the P&As sue at the state level and some even at the federal level to ensure that the voters in that state could vote privately and independently from home. But then there were some that said you can only do paper ballots. But if you have difficulty in using a pen or any type of dexterity issues, then how are you going to be able to do that? What if you didn't have a printer at home? How are you going to print things off the computer and then mail it in? So there were so many different layers to consider, but because we all work together across the network, we had meetings across the network, and we were able to brainstorm how best to approach the issue within our state, but also to show a united front at the federal level as well, which I think is the beauty about the network and the strength that we have when we all come together to push back on anything that's going to have a negative effect on our community.
Hopefully like the people in this room.
Yes.
So Marlene, I have to say, one of the things I really love about you, working with you, being with you, is you have what I call fire in the belly.
Oh, yeah.
Right? This clarity of conviction. And I'm just interested to know, was there anyone like along the way when you were coming up that inspired you, or maybe was a powerful mentor in any way that you had?
My abuela. That's my grandma. Third grade education. We immigrated to this country in 1966. She took care of kids in the household, and she was a seamstress in Cuba. So she got a part-time job with my aunt, who owned a dry cleaner, because my aunt had been in the United States since the mid-50s. And she would do sewing and patching in the evenings. And my mom worked 2 jobs. She legal aid in Harlem, Spanish Harlem, and then went to school at night to learn English. But abuelita was always there. Like, she was the constant. And she passed away 10 years ago at the age of 92. Until this day, she's my guiding light. She's my guardian angel. Everything I do to make her and my, yeah. To make her and my grandfather proud, because, when they brought me here, we didn't leave Cuba because we didn't love our country. We didn't leave Cuba because we wanted to live in America because it was better here. It was good for us. But Castro came and he took it all away. And it was oppressive, and it was a communist regime. And thankfully, my aunt had already lived here in the States since the mid-50s. My grandfather was working in New Orleans and sending money home. And anyway, we came here and they always said to me, we brought you here so that you could have freedom of speech. We brought you here so that you could speak your mind and not be concerned about retaliation from the government. And that is the beauty, right, about living in the US of A, is that I have a First Amendment right, which I would not have had in Cuba. My father's still there. My brother and my sister are still there. I have aunts and uncles and nephews. I will not set foot in that country. I will not put money into that regime's economy until that regime falls. And yes, Castro died, and then Raul was in power. For those that don't know, Raul was the head of the firing squad for many, many years. I'm not setting foot in that island. So I've never seen my dad again since I was 2.5. And it's not doable. So my grandmother always reminded me, you can do whatever you set your mind to. And you are here so that you have the opportunity to become and be all that you can be. Don't be scared of anything. Just look within yourself and find that strength. And I remember when she was, when I left Florida to continue my career, she was angry, right? Because it's old school. You don't leave the house until you're married. Well, by then I was divorced, and it was still like, okay, you're divorced now. You still have to stay home. And I was like, no, abuela, that doesn't work that way. And I had 2 youngins with me, and we traveled to South Carolina, worked there for 2 years. She was mad. And then I made it to DC, and a year into DC, I got tapped to join the Obama administration. And by then she was in hospice. But she was cognizant enough at the time to realize that all the sacrifices I made for my children and all the sacrifices she made worked out, because now I, as a Latina and immigrant, was working for a president. And so I hope and pray that when she passed at peace. But till this day, every time I do something, I hear her voice like, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. Just do it. And that's what I do. So I've always, like, I close my eyes, I jump and see where I land.
Love it. I'm sorry that we only have time for one more question.
Thank you.
But I'm glad that, yeah, everybody here gets a sense of you and what an incredible leader you are. And it's a really diverse group, right? But we all care about the same things. So what advice would you have for a group of disability rights advocates, different kinds of disabilities, different jobs, walks of life, to come together and work so that all people with disabilities of all walks of life can really choose the kind of life they want to lead?
I think we all need to realize that we all deserve to be able to live the life that we need, that we want for ourselves. We all deserve to have a voice. We all deserve to succeed, whichever way you define success, right? But sometimes it's really difficult if we're doing it alone. And so we have to join forces. We have to come to the table together and work towards these common goals. And we have to stop, as a society, othering people. We have to stop, as a society, assuming that because you're not like me, perhaps you don't deserve the same thing that I do. We have to understand that we all have a right to live in our homes. We all have a right to live in our community. We all have a right to have our own personal life. And sometimes folks with disabilities, especially those in the IDD community, are othered, and it's assumed, right? That they don't have the quote unquote capacity to make their own decisions. And so we need to advocate for everyone, and we need to come together and continue that work on a daily basis, because there are things out here on a constant basis bombarding us as a society as a whole. There are things that we need to be worried about on a constant basis. But if we know that everyone in this room has the same vision for our community, and that everyone in this room is willing to do the work side by side with one another, then we can really succeed in ensuring equal rights for all and not just some.
Thank you for being here.
You're
We are
welcome.
so grateful.
Thank you. And just remember, love one another, right? You have to love one another. Yeah, and yes, you have to love yourself first. Show up for yourself every single day. So thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Marlena.
Thanks.